So I just want to do a quick introduction right now of AgKnow. I know we've been talking about AgKnow and around AgKnow with this series, but we haven't really really, I think, told everybody kind of the story of what we're doing. So just to give you an idea, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we've been working on the mental health file for farmers since 2019. And so the agriculture service boards are boards in our I just need to make this go away. Here we go. Our boards within each municipality that has agriculture in it that support agriculture. And they give policy advice to the ministry and they help with programming. And they're just a really good advocate for farmers within their municipality. And in 2019, they passed a resolution asking for farm-specific mental health resources and services, and they asked that of the minister. And at the same time, there was other businesses, agriculture businesses and associations that were also lobbying the government for mental health services specifically for farmers. So the farming community has seen that there's an issue and they were reaching out in many ways. So the minister gave Erica some money and said, what do we do with this farm mental health? So we did a needs assessment looking on the healthcare side of things as well as on the farming side of things and trying to bring the two together and figure out what's needed in Alberta. And these are just the timelines of some of the other things that were going on at the same time that was happening. And AgKnow is what's happened in Alberta. So AgKnow is being supported by the Ministry of Agriculture in Alberta as well as in Canada to find and support farm mental health in the province. So that's what we're up to. So the reason that we want, here's our mission and our vision and some of the stats that go along with that. We are working within the mental health ecosystem in Alberta, which is why we're engaged with you guys. So, and again, it's supported by Alberta and Canada. So why Counseling Alberta? So we wanted to partner with you because we know that you are a way that Albertans have access to affordable counseling services without wait times. And we know that's because of the provincial investment. And right after that announcement was made, I waited a little while to see what was going to happen. And then I reached out to Robbie to just ask, like, how can we help? How can we be a part of this? Our goal is to help increase the number of farm-informed supports options for farmers. And we know from research that a barrier to farmers using services like Counseling Alberta is the perception that the therapist will not understand them and that the advice will not be practical for their farm life. So, and we've also been asked by private and public counseling services to give them some training around farming and what's the context and what are the issues, and they just want to know how they can support farmers with their mental health needs. And so we're trying to develop some kind of a self-directed course offering that kind of gives that background and keeps people up to date with what we're up to. So that's why we're engaged with you and why we're doing this stakeholder engagement. We really want to pick your brain and figure out what needs to go in that course so it's most effective and is really targeted. So I'm just gonna get you to think back to October 3rd for any of you that were on our first attempt at this farm culture offering. This one was called Farming in Alberta, and it was an overview of farming to just kind of help set the stage and bust some myths around farming in Alberta. So our thinking was it was useful to know what kinds of farms are in Alberta. I mean, there's no use learning about fish or oranges if we don't grow them here. So we wanted you to kind of get an idea of who the farmers are, what they're kind of growing, and what the conditions are, that kind of thing, just a little bit of background. And we find that this was, our thinking was that this would give you some background so that you can help build those trust relationships that are needed in a therapeutic relationship. Crystal, could you paste the first question in the chat? So what we're going to do is just ask you to add your comments in the chat on this question. So we just want to know what your key takeaways were from this session. If you can remember back, I'll just talk you through it a little bit. I don't have any of the visuals to go along with it. what we want to know what pieces of this presentation stood out to you, what surprised you, what was the most beneficial to you. I also I have a Microsoft form that I'm making. It just wasn't quite done, so I couldn't give it to you right now. So I'll send it out after this meeting where you can, it's the same kind of questions and you can add thoughts. So, and we'll keep that open until Friday. So if you have thoughts later that you'd like to give us some feedback on, we really would appreciate that. So if you recall, Rebecca presented a timeline of the history of agriculture. It had some events that stood out to her and her students on it. She also talked a bit about the census of agriculture, demographics, gender, that sort of thing. One part that she did that we really liked was she had a narrative between a woman farmer and her therapist, and invited you to post questions in the chat on the words that you maybe didn't know or were curious about. I really like this approach, and I'm thinking this is something that we might want to add to the end offering. But I would like to know from your perspective what you thought of that. Was it effective? Is there do you have suggestions for us? What would have been better, or what would make it better? So any comments you have about that little exercise she had in there, we really would appreciate. Rebecca or Crystal, I think there's a question number 2 associated with that. I don't know if you pasted it. I can't see the chat. So so go ahead and paste question 2 and I think question 3. Feel free to bounce back and forth in these questions and add things as we go. Let's see. I think that's it. And then if you want to put in question 4 as well. So just general, what you thought of the session, what anything else you'd like to learn in those sessions. I know I'm going really fast, but I don't want to waste any time. I think everybody can be unmuted if you want to talk, right? I think everybody has the option to do that. So if you want to ask any questions. And Crystal, just you'll have to tell me if somebody's asking a question because I can't see the chat or anything. So is there anything anybody wanted to add to this before we go to the next piece? Okay, so we're just keep on trucking then. So in the farming in Alberta, we had some feedback from our stakeholders. We've been asking these questions all along with any kind of engagement we have. And just to remind you, our stakeholders are the agriculture service boards, they're ag businesses, they're ag associations and farmers that are reaching out to us directly. So one of the things that we wanted to just highlight is that in Alberta, farms are large. And why this comes up is when you contrast it with farms in BC or in Eastern Canada, the prairies have these vast, large farming operations that just blow the mind of the federal government when we talk about them. They just don't have the same context in the East and the West, or East and in BC as they do in Alberta. So we have a large farm size, but it's related to our environment. We are the prairies, and the prairies grow grass. So wheat, barley, oats are the crops that kind of grow really well here. And of course, we have grazing livestock, which grows really well here. I think, is there a question for this one? I don't know if there is a question for this slide. No, okay. So just any impressions you have while we're going through what we've heard from our stakeholders, if you want to give us any feedback, again, just dump it in the chat and we will, or raise your hand and talk or whatever makes sense for you. So one of the things that is unique to the prairies is the size of the farms, like I said, with the grasslands. And so what the implication of that is, or the so what part of that is it's not unusual for one full-time farmer to be farming anywhere from 8 to 10,000 acres. Now, if they have off-farm income, so they're working off-farm, they tend to be less than those 8,000 acres. But when you get to be a full-time farmer, between that 8 and 10,000 is kind of the maximum one full-time farmer with just a little bit of casual labor seasonally can handle. And so that is not that unusual in Alberta. We have those bigger size farms. But what that means is you can be very isolated on your farm. And we find that because Alberta is such a large province, isolation and loneliness tend to be problems in different parts of the province. So when we get out to the east side and we go down the Saskatchewan border, the farms there are very, very large because the productivity is so low. The land is poor quality and there's less rain, and so they have less animals per acre, and so you have these vast big areas of farms, and farms can be quite a few miles apart before you see your neighbor. So there's 4,000 farmers in the special areas. So that's from like south of Provost all the way to just north of Medicine Hat. There's only like 4,000 farmers in there. So, or not farmers, sorry, people in there. So it's a very sparsely populated part of the province. And we see this happening also in the Peace. And so isolation and loneliness can be a problem. And I hear from farmers when I go and do talks at different events and working with farmers across the province. I know farmers that get jobs, not because they need it for the income, but just so that they have that interaction with people on a regular basis. So isolation is a thing to be considering about. The other thing that's unique in the prairies is that we grow really low quality, or no, really low priced commodities. So, like strawberries are worth more than flour, right? So that we grow these low priced commodities, which means, and we have these vast acres, and we know the value of land. So we have a really high, it costs a lot of money to buy into a farm and set up a farming operation. And yet the commodity that we produce is a really low cost commodity. And so it means that the margins are really tight. So there's a high risk. Farmers carry a high risk, a high amount of financial investment to produce something that isn't worth very much in the end. And so what happens is you need to have that off-farm income or an inheritance of some kind to get established into a farm. It's really hard to you as just a person to go out and say, I'm going to make a farm. It's a really hard thing to do because of the high overhead. So I know there was a question in one of these events that we did previously where they're like, how do we get farmers to stop having so many jobs? Well, that's how we get established. So I'm a first generation farmer because my dad decided that he wanted to keep his whole farm to himself and not inherit it to his kids. And so I get to be first generation, which means I know that I will never be in a position to actually stay as a full-time farmer at home. And so I do work. And so this contract is the work that I do to invest in the land so that maybe my kids, if they choose, will leverage what I've put together at equity to maybe build. And so maybe in 2 or 3 generations, we might actually have a farm where somebody could stay home and just farm, which would be amazing. So that's one thing. Another one, operation types. So I'm repurposing some of these slides so they're not well branded and they're not exactly on as polished as I'd like them to be for this. So just bear with me. So what I want you to know from this slide is 2 things. So farmers are people, and they are very diverse in their approach in business. My job and my career has been around education, adult education, extension we call it, for farmers around farming practices. And what we find is there's a very few amount of farmers that can be considered the innovators that are really open to new ideas and they're trying new stuff. Then we got these early adopter kind of guys that are watching the innovators and they're like, oh, that's not so bad. And then they'll try it themselves. And we have a whole bunch of farmers that are kind of in the middle that watch the innovators, but they still like their traditional ways and they kind of are between the two. And then we have this last group, we call them the laggers all the time in our profession. We're calling them the laggers, and they will not adopt anything. They want things to be the same way as they were for their dad and their grandpa, and they don't really see any reason why they should change. And so when you see a farm client coming to you, you're going to find them somewhere in that spectrum of really innovative and traditionalist. The innovative people tend to have a whole army of advisors, and so they will be really open to therapeutic approaches and reaching out for help when they need that support. The traditionalists tend to just well, dad never did it, so why would I kind of attitude. And so it's different kinds of farmers that you're going to see. Um, the other thing to notice is that the majority of the farm types are sole proprietors. So sole proprietors are someone who owns their own business like myself. So I am a sole proprietor. I started a farming operation, and so I make all the decisions. I take on all the risk, and all of the financial obligations are mine. Then you have partnerships, which I am responsible to a partner if I had done it in a partnership, or a family corporation. And the family corporations are getting a little more popular just because of tax reasons. So it's just another way of incorporating your farm, but it requires you to build out like a business plan, a structure, and to have annual meetings. And the same with a partnership. You're kind of required to do and have those conversations about how you're doing your farm and what's happening, and communicating around the business end of it. Sole proprietors, there's no obligation for me to have a business plan or have those discussions with my kids. And so this is leading, or can lead, to a lot of serious problems. So let's just think this through. So I have a farm. I grow my kids up here. They participate in 4-H and stuff. So they're opening gates. I'm getting them to fix fence. They're doing stuff and actively engaged in the farm. And so they start to feel a sense of ownership, as you would, right? This barn or this truck or this cow or this whatever, they have a sense of ownership. But actually, legally, everything belongs to me. And so if we never stop and have that conversation about what this is going to look like, and what your investment of your time as my child, your investment of time, or maybe even money or whatever it is, how that's going to pay out to you, if we never have that conversation, and then I get to retirement stage and I look at my equity and I think, you know what, this would be a really great place in Florida, or that island I keep looking at in the Bahamas, and I take it all and run away, it can be really damaging to the kids who thought they were part of the operation and thought of themselves as having ownership, and they had their identity in that farm. So right now in Alberta, we're in a situation where we have a huge opportunity for family dynamics to not only affect the business decisions, but also how that farm transitions to the next generation. And there is a staggering amount, and I couldn't find the stat, so I can't even tell you what the actual stat is, staggering amount of farm assets that have to change or will be changing hands in the next 10 years. Our farmers are getting older. I mean, the median age is 55 or 56, and it keeps going up every census. So how many of them are in their 70s and 80s and are going to be transitioning farms in the next few years, who haven't had these kind of discussions with their kids? And you'll think, and our stakeholders are telling us, is going to be the #1 challenge that people are going to be reaching out for help with therapists. So farm statistics. These are just some, again, it's from a different presentation. So I apologize that sometimes it's talking about farming and sometimes it's talking about farmer. But this is some things that you might be interested in. So all in Alberta, the majority of farms are beef or oilseed and grains. And just to give you a bigger picture of the 79% of farmers are married, we have to remember that there's a lot of Hutterite farmers in our province, and their demographic and how their religion impacts who they are, it impacts these statistics as well. So we got to keep that in mind as well. And we also have a very high Mennonite, traditional Mennonite kind of population, specifically in the Peace. There's a really good grouping of them, but a lot of the Mexican Mennonites that have been settling in the Two Hills area, farming is part of what they do. So we have to remember those kind of populations when we're talking about these statistics as well. 53% have post-secondary education, and 30% have benefits through off-farm employment. Now, that doesn't mean that they have. I tried to see if they had a statistic somewhere about how many people could access those benefits for mental health support, and I couldn't find anything. So I'm thinking that they don't have it delineated that way in any kind of statistics. There are some programs that with the cooperators insurance and that kind of stuff, but it's not well adopted here in Alberta compared to other provinces. So in other provinces, the Agriculture Federation kind of represents large amounts of farmers, and that doesn't happen here in Alberta. And the Agriculture Federation is the one that promotes the um, um, extended health benefit packages. So it's one piece that we might be able to do some make some movement on here in Alberta to champion that program and try to get more people adopting it. The other thing we wanted you to know that farmers are getting older. So 62% of our farmers are over the age of 55, and only 9% of our farmers are under the age of 35. There is some statistics about they're starting to follow women in farming. It's a thing. So they're keeping some statistics about the amount of women farmers in Canada, and Alberta and BC are both leading the way for the number of women farmers that are coming into agriculture. However, when you dig a little bit deeper, you find that most of these women are taking on farms that have revenues over 500,000, which would imply that they are well-established multi-generation farms that these women are now becoming the owners of. And with the aging of our farmers and stuff, I think there's a case to be made for not having a succession plan set up with a farm, and maybe dad passing away, and so it goes to mom while they're trying to sort out how to pass on this bazillion dollars of investment. So that's another thing that's kind of interesting about where we are right now in agriculture is the farmers that are retiring now are retiring later and later. So they're getting into their 70s and 80s. And when they were young and at an age when the farm was being transitioned from their parents, their parents couldn't give the farm away. The kids were all like, no thanks. Nope, not for me, right? So it was really hard. You were either very passionate about agriculture and so you took it over, or you were told. And there were some of these farmers, when you talk to them, they're like, well, all my brothers left, so I had to take the farm, right? Like that's kind of the attitude of it. But over the course of the last, 50 years, the value of the farms have gone up because of the value of the land has gone up. So now all of a sudden these farmers that started off with the thinking nobody else was going to want this farm, I don't know what I'm going to do with it when I retire, are all of a sudden ending up so equity rich that every single kid's like, oh, I want a piece of that. So it puts them in a different place, and they don't have the structure and the infrastructure and the people around them for financial advisors and that kind of thing to help them with that. So they haven't prepared for it because it wasn't a thing, and it just because of circumstance now it's a thing. And there's a lot of farms in that position right now, and that leads to a lot of struggles with relationships within the family. Is there any questions? I know I'm going through this really fast. Anybody want to ask a question or? Good?
Linda,
Yep.
I just, this is so interesting. All of this information I just found really, really interesting. I was brought up in farm area in Ontario, and you would think I would know this, but I don't. What stood out to me is the partners of the sons and daughters of farmers. So dad died, mom's got the farm, oldest son is stepping in. Oldest son's wife is not a farmer, doesn't want anything to do with the farm. And so that relationship is at risk because the oldest son is trying to help out mom, but the wife really is not interested. So there's a lot of conflict there, not just between the oldest son and I think there's two other boys, but the partners of those children, and they get pulled into this conflict as well.
Yeah, and that's a challenge because like in Canada, there's what is it? It's 1 point something% of people in Canada are farmers. And so when you think of how small that population is, when you're bringing a spouse into a relationship that's a farm family relationship, most likely they aren't farm cultured. Like, they're coming from outside of that, and we see lots of examples in that. And actually, if you follow social media and you're in Instagram, which I try not to be in there, but there's actually quite a few moms or women who have been brought into a farming operation, and it's going really well, but they have these like, wow, this is what it is to be a farm wife, and they do like blogging and stuff, and it's quite interesting to watch what they have going on there. But there's a lot of negative and sad stories too. One of the things that I've noticed personally, and I'm in my 40s, and so I hang out with farmers that are in their 40s and 50s, and there's a kind of a number of ones that their wife was off farm and didn't have much to do with the farm, and the husband was so focused. Like, it's so hard to build that farming operation, and it's getting harder because of um, um, how much more expensive the land has got. But they started back, 20 years ago doing this. And their wife wasn't really engaged. She kind of kept the family going and kept the kids in sports while dad was just really focused on the farm. And then it comes to a point when she's like, okay, the kids are grown up, they've gone off, they're doing their schooling or whatever, we have more time. Okay, now is when we're going to go on a trip. Now is when you're going to engage with me. Now we're going to go and do all these fun things. And if the farmer's like, no, I'm working. And so she's like, all right. And she divorces him, takes half of it, and go lives a really happy life with a few $1,000,000. And that is happening a lot with those farmers in that age group, where the wife she puts up with it. And then at one point she's like, that's enough. So there's a lot of dynamics. And so when I say family dynamics, I mean, that's a broad spectrum of what's going on. But the underlying base thing that we can talk about is we can say with facts that the value of the farm has increased really fast and rapidly, and the farming families are not prepared for that. And we have a high number of farmers that are in that retirement phase, and a whole lot of equity that has to change hands without having those conversations or taking the time to put those plans together. Now, one thing to note is we call that succession planning, and the federal government in their agriculture stats have been following that for a while. And Alberta is leading the way. We have, I think in 2021 stats, the ag stats, it said that there was about 20% of our farmers, which is way higher than anywhere else. When they report that in Canada, it's like 8% have an actual written down succession plan. And I think that 20% was just written and oral. So it wasn't just the written ones, because the written ones are solid, right? But so Albertans are leading the way in that a little bit. And it might have something to do with there's just more affluence in Alberta. So maybe that's part of, they have more money to invest in that. I'm not really sure what that trend is. But yeah, it's kind of a scary landscape when you look at it.
Are there lawyers that specialize in succession planning for farmers? Because I'm thinking this is something that requires more than just a conversation. You need lawyers involved. You need all kinds of information. Or is there a body of lawyers that actually specialize in this kind of business?
There are people that are lawyers, accountants, and just what would that be? Mediators that work in this. Yeah. And so the Farm Credit Canada actually has a really cool program where you get 5 hours with a specialist that sits down with your family and kind of makes a map of these are the people you need to talk to, and these are the kinds of things you're going to want to have the discussions, and kind of lays it all out. Pardon me. So a year ago, we connected with them and we said, okay, we're playing in the mental health space. We're building this initiative. What is it that we could do that would help facilitate what you guys are doing? Because you're trying to get this adoption of these succession plannings and these conversations. And they said to us, they're like, we sit down with this family and we think it's going to be a great succession plan. We get our pens out and say, okay, who's getting what and what's happening? And he says, and then we find out mom hasn't been living at the farm for a year because she's just had it with dad and dad is drinking and the son has an addiction and the daughter is, and she's like, it just like, whoa, what the heck is going on here? And she's like, we don't know what to do with that. She says, we can refer them to a lawyer, we can refer them to an accountant, we can refer them to a mediator, but how do we refer them to someone that will help them sort out the relationships and have those heart conversations that need to have to really sort out what they want to do and what they can do to begin with before they even get to the lawyers. And that's what they said that they saw was the reason that we were having so few succession plans being built is people get stopped at the relationship conversations and can't get past it. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's who we're engaged with is FCC. And then we're also trying to find those people, those special people that are specializing in that and pull them together. And we want to build that out on our website so that we have sort of a referral place where people can start those succession that when they're looking, here's some of the people in Alberta that can help you. So stay tuned. That's on the list. That's why we hired Cornelius. He's going to help us with that. All right. So the next event that we had was on October 10th, and it was Understanding Farm Culture. So in this session was to be an overview of some of the findings about farm stress and coping and how that relates to farm culture. So our goal was to give you some insights into what issues farmers are dealing with right now and help with the establishing of trust and finding approaches that align with farm life, because those are the two things our stakeholders told us. So Crystal, if you could post the first question. Again, it's just really broad questions, what the takeaways were, what pieces of this event were most meaningful for you. And same questions. Oh, I also have some slides. This one, I have some slides that I can share with you that to kind of help joggle your memory of the kinds of things that Rebecca discussed. So I know the clunky questions in the chat. I'm really sorry about that. We need a better process, and Cornelius has some awesome ideas, so I'm expecting these stakeholder things to go way better on the next round. So maybe just put up question 2 as well, Crystal, and then you guys feel free to just dump your thoughts into those questions as we go. So this is one slide that Rebecca brought up. It might have looked a little bit different, but this is the same infographic. So that same company, Farm Credit Canada, they did a survey. These are all the things that they said the farmers identified that were stressing them out. And then these are the ones that are coming out of the Alberta research that have kind of sifted their way to the top. These are the ones that have the highest priority with our farmers. Dealing with bad weather, time pressure, lack of manpower, equipment breakdowns, and planning for retirement. And it's interesting to me as a farmer when I read that list is that all of those are related to our short, really intense growing season. So something that's unique about Canada, particularly in the prairies, is that we have a very tight window to get our crops in, to get them off, to get our animals out, to get the ground grazed, to get the bales baled up. You know, all the work that we have to do happens in such a narrow window. And it can be just like you could be off by a day. You have a breakdown, and so it slows you down by a day, and then it snows, and then you didn't get your crop off, right? Like one day can make a huge difference to your bottom line and to whether you make it or break it in 1 year, right? Especially if you're one of those farmers that's that 9% that's trying to build their farming operation. So one setback, one challenging setback like that could just like knock you out of the game entirely. And so those ones are under high amount of pressure and taking on considerable amount of financial risk. So that bad weather, that's where the time pressure comes in. And it was interesting to me, we just went through a hiring process, and one of the people we interviewed actually decided that she wanted to get a more regular job because her job was working with farmers doing some marketing. And she said, because of their tight, they put you off, and then now is when I need you and you need to do it. And so she's like, the time pressure of working under such a tight, narrow time frame. So it's not just the farming that does it, but all of the other pieces and the people that support farmers end up in that same kind of panic mode, really intense work hours kind of thing, right? So it doesn't surprise me that these are the stressors, and I thought that was really interesting how our intense growing season really affects these. And the other piece that people don't think about this, but when you get farther south in the States, they have custom combiners and they have custom guys that'll come spray for you, and they have these custom guys. And it's easier to share your equipment because there's less pressure to get it all off this week. And so when the weather's good, everybody's out there harvesting all at once. So we all need our own combine. We're in the States, in parts of the States, you don't have to, everybody doesn't have to have a combine. It can sit in the field for a week while you wait for the combine to get done at the neighbors and then come to your place. So what ends up happening is we have a really high financial overload in Canadian, especially on the prairies farms. So our equipment and our land are really expensive, and because of our tight growing season, it's hard to share that expense around. And so that's just something that makes us unique over other parts where it's maybe a little warmer. Another thing she talked about was the recent research that was done in Canada that showed that farmers had higher rates of anxiety, depression, and chronic stress. So this is the study that was done nationally, and then Rebecca has repeated it in Alberta, and we're just waiting for her results to come out and expecting to see how Alberta fares compared to the national numbers. She also talked about suicidal ideation. The same research showed that the suicide ideation was twice as high in farmers compared to the general population. And 1 in 4 farmers surveyed reported that their life was not worth that they thought that their life was not worth living, wished they were dead, or had thought of taking their own life during the past 12 months. And that was in a study that was done in 2022. So this is a high suicide rate. It's not something that's unusual. It's been reported since 2016 in the States. That's what started the whole farm mental health movement in Canada, was that suicide research that came out in the States in 2016. So our response, we have a response to that, but we can talk about that later. And then, of course, the current Canadian research on how farmer mental health is changing over time. So depression, anxiety, burnout, women were faring worse than men in some of the studies, and men had higher rates of hazardous or harmful alcohol consumption. And 1 in 5 were reached out for help. So there's really low rates of people actually reaching out for help, which is part of what we're trying to do, is just build that awareness and reduce the stigma so that people reach out for the help that they need. The other thing to think about when we're talking about supports and farmer mental health is how many farmers, how many psychologists that are actually available in the rural areas. And so this is probably really not new numbers to you, but in Canada, there's 1 psychologist for every 28,500 people in rural areas, where in the urban centers, there's 1 psychologist for every 3,484 people in those areas. And the other thing to bear in mind is how the conductivity is. I know we like to do everything remotely, and that's one of the benefits of Counseling Alberta, is that you can go to all parts of the province provided they have that broadband service. But getting that service out into the rural areas is really challenging. You can absolutely have a copy of this PowerPoint. I just have to do a little bit of editing before I send it out. Yeah, but yes, you can have this PowerPoint, absolutely. Oh, there's a question, Tina.
Thanks, Linda. I was raised on a farm here in central Alberta. I live rurally. And so this really does speak to who I am and how I was raised. This slide brings up something really dear to me, because in the community that I'm in, we just had a tragedy on the highway, and one of my greats was involved. My great nephew, I just call him great. Yeah. And it really does speak. Like, I went out to the crash site, and just hung out in the ditch with all the teenagers. And it really speaks to what is available to our communities. But
Yeah.
something that I haven't seen, or forgive me if I missed it, but the support systems, because even though there's not a lot of therapists, what we have with support systems, the food that was showing up at my nephew's house to support
so
these
nice.
kids, like we had
Yeah.
7, 9 teenagers spending every night at the house to wrap around this family. And they were coming from like 2 communities over, all these buns and meats
Yeah.
and cheeses and all this stuff to feed all of these people. The whole community comes together, and that's not something that you see in the urban areas of. It doesn't matter if you were friends, if you knew the family, the fact that there was a tragedy really does bring everyone together. And I think that in urban areas, it's important for that understanding so that we can speak to our clients, because often we're talking about what supports do you have?
Yep.
But we don't really understand that it's the neighbors, it's the community, it's the churches. We've got
Yeah.
more churches in one block than most people in the city. And so it's all of these supports that are so very important. So thank you. I just wanted to bring that point up.
Yes, and you're speaking right to my heart, because that's something that I keep bringing up. Like, what are the supports? Not everybody is tied into that, and I love rural communities, and I've lived in different ones in different places. And what I find is the farther you get away from the big urban centers, the more grounded people are into their community and connected that they are, the more that kind of support happens. So I was in Tofield, and there's just a high transient population in Tofield. We're close enough to the city that people come and they go, and they come and they go, and you don't have that quite the same tight knit that you were talking about. So it is really interesting to see that dynamic in rural communities and how people support each other. And one of the values that has come through loud and clear with our stakeholders is that peer-to-peer support and support within a community structure instead of by individual is really important to our rural farming communities. Like, that's huge. And so one of our strategic goals, actually, and one of the recommendations that went to the minister, was to somehow acknowledge and increase the importance of supporting things like minor sports and ag societies and community groups in rural areas, so that they don't get axed. That accidentally almost happened under NDP because they didn't understand the implication of what they were doing, right? And it's because those are the ways that we connect as a community, and that's how we support the mental health of the people in those areas, is being able to have those interactions. So absolutely, and that has to be a part of our farm culture offering in the end. But right now I'm just trying to give you what Rebecca had going on. So one of the things that we heard from our stakeholders is that, you know, we're Albertans too. Farmers aren't this weird alien nation, right? They're Albertans too, and they value the same things as other Albertans. They value the environment, they value healthy food, they care about animal welfare. They eat from the grocery store. I eat from the grocery store. I eat, and I make my kids eat from the grocery store. We drink from the tap. Like, those values for our environment and sustainability and stuff resonate even stronger, I would say, in the farming community than they do in an urban community, because they have a direct impact on how those things play out in the world. So feeding people is an honorable profession, and there's a lot of pride wrapped up in the ability and being allowed to feed people. Like, it's a thing. I learned from my kids that food is love. If I make them lunch, and when they were little, when I made them their lunches, it meant so much to them. And now when they're old, if they're in my house and I make them coffee in the morning, it's just like I'm Santa Claus or something. And it's so simple, right? And there's just something about food and providing it for people that gives that well-being, right?
Linda?
Another thing they wanted us to emphasize. Oh, go ahead.
So sorry, Linda. We have a
Yep.
question from Christine.
Sure. Yep.
Linda, I'm thinking about the current situation with trying to hire people. And wonder if you've got, could you speak to that for farmers? And there's when I lived in Ontario, my mother actually was a manager of a farm labor pool. And that was a constant concern, was the farmers needed a farmhand. And sometimes that would work and sometimes that wouldn't work. But could you speak to that in terms of the Alberta situation and their ability to hire?
Yeah. So farm labor continues to be an issue in Alberta, but I don't think at the same pace as it is in Ontario, where they have all those vegetable growers that have all that handwork, right? So in Alberta, we tend to do things, we mechanize them. Although I have to say, and I need to acknowledge this, that there is more and more of those urban vegetable local production kind of farms that are popping up in Alberta, and they would have that same issue with getting that farm labor requirements. So in Alberta, because we have such a tight growing season, or tight narrow windows for getting the work done, there tends to be parts of the season where you could use like full-time 4 or 5 people, but there just isn't a business model that lets you keep them for the whole year. So that leads to a really tricky model. And I think that also is why we see a lot of family farms happening, because you can grow kids into helping you, and your family wants to help you, and they know that you can't have someone for the full time. So a lot of farmers, I find it's dad and dad's friends that are running the combines that have retired, like the grandpas are doing the combining, grandma's riding in the truck, like you pull in your community of people and to get through those busy times. And so if you don't have those communities of people that you can pull from, it can be a huge challenge to get through seeding and harvest if you're a cropper, or even through calving and roundups. Even Crystal gets to get pulled out onto a horse to help with roundups with some of her friends when they're rounding up the cattle at the end of the year. So like it is a very tricky thing for sure. Did that answer your question reasonably enough, Christine?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Temporary foreign workers are becoming a thing with our barns. There's a lot of our barn workers that, when they're not Hutterites, like the non-Hutterite barns, so the pigs and the chickens, are getting foreign workers. And so that is a growing concern in agriculture, and we want to also address and make sure that we have the supports for them. So anything we're doing in AgKnow is for the farmers, the farm family members, and the farm employees, to kind of cover those things off. So having some understanding of that is really helpful. Okay, we're going to try to get through this in the last 10 minutes. So farmers are hard workers. This is a culture thing that is it's so funny. Like my kids, like my youngest son picks on my older son because he works more hours a week, right? And to try to reverse that thinking and say it's okay not to work 90 hours a week, like it's okay, right? But we work a lot and we like to brag about it. It's a thing. It's a farmer thing. So most farmers, or a lot of farmers, have off-farm jobs because, like I said, the commodity that you're producing, the cash flow from that does not cover the cost of the land. We think of our farming and we have a real estate investment, and then we have the farm operation. And so how do you pay for the real estate? That's your off-farm income, right? So that's what's happening here. The other thing is, and this speaks to what I think it was Tina was talking about with the community coming around and supporting people, is there's a lot of volunteering that has to happen in the rural area just to get things done. Our first responders are all volunteer, and a lot of them are farmers. And so there's that PTSD and that trauma that comes from being the first responder. I heard this horrible story. A farmer friend of mine had to help pick his friend out of a feed processor. So it chopped him up into little pieces, and he actually had to help pull the body parts out as a first responder. So like these are the kinds of things that happen in rural areas. Everybody pitches in. We try to do our best, but sometimes we don't make smart choices, like, letting friends help with the recovery of the body was probably not a good choice. And so like there are things that happen that are really traumatic, and you will find that in your conversations with farmers. But they're also like coaches and community maintenance, like working on the church, maintaining the church, maintaining the community halls, They do a lot of board work. So board work and governance is just a part of rural life, which is why we have so many leaders that come out of the rural areas and end up being like chief of police or prime minister or whatever they end up being. So we do a lot of things in a governance with boards and committees. And there's a lot of that. The 4-H kind of trains kids to do that. And if you have a really good rural school, they also train kids up on how governance works. And that's how we work in the rural areas. And a lot of things get done that way. So here's the succession plans. Written succession plan or verbal succession plan or no succession. So succession is I'm going to retire and my son is going to carry on the legacy of the farm, or my daughter is going to carry on the legacy of the farm, or someone or the neighbor's kid or whatever. That's succession. So we've actually changed our words. We're not using succession, we're using transition, because the farmer isn't letting go, but he's just transitioning. So instead of driving the truck and making sure the grain gets into the right bin, now he's driving the combine. So he's just moving to a different role in the family, but the family continues on. I was just reading some of stuff that came out this summer from Stats Canada, and one of the trends is they said that we have a growing urban population of farmers, but from our stakeholders, what we hear is the patriarch is hanging on to the farm and moving to town. And the farm continues on, and he either contracts it out or he has his kids working, or there's some keeping the farm going. So he's still counting himself as a farmer, but he's living in town. So how much of that is urban farming and how much of that is I'm retiring, but I'm going to keep my assets and keep the business going? So we find that farmers just are not passing the torch. They're not doing succession. They're doing transition. We're just going to have different roles. And if they do it well and they involve a lawyer and they have those nice heart conversations, it can be done in a way that's really beneficial and keeps the farm going from one generation to the next. There we go. So here are some of the things that we're doing at AgKnow. Just as is there any other questions before I kind of tell you what we're up to, just so you kind of know what we're doing? So one of the things that we did is we found recruited 12 therapists that are from Alberta that were either farmers, had grown up on a farm, or have been working with farm clients, and we got them onto our website and got them up there. The benefit of working with Counseling Alberta is all of ours are private business, so they're quite expensive, and as you heard earlier, only 30% of people have benefits. So we're trying to do both, and we'd love to have Counseling Alberta up there on our website as well, just alongside with some of our other ones. Therapist Network. The other one we have, the other thing about our Therapist Network is that they've agreed to be a part of some kind of crisis recovery. So we're still working out what that looks like, but we want to have some kind of way of allowing or linking our clients or people that have a farm tragedy. Like a few years ago, there was some kids that were playing in some canola and suffocated. Well, then we'd like to be able to bring one of our therapists in to speak with that family and do some of that grief and recovery afterwards. So the not crisis response, but crisis recovery work. And Red Cross Canada has asked us if we would build that capacity in our organization so that they could refer us. So there might be a way that Counseling Alberta can be a part of doing that. I don't know. That's something that we can continue to talk about. Mental health resources. So they asked specifically for mental health resources and services. And so we are creating a resource library on our website. It's going to have things that are more factual with lots of reference documents to it, and then ones that you could maybe hand out to clients, that kind of stuff, and then some media ones to kind of help get the conversation and keep people engaged in the community and do some of that stigma work. So that's what we're working on there. We have a few course offerings that we're doing. We can also host an event. Organizations can ask us to come and host, and we're just getting the resources. I'm so excited to have Cornelius with us to actually start getting out in community. And Crystal and I have a few events happening later this month, which is why it's so exciting and busy right now at AgKnow, but that's what we're working on. And those are events to help increase access and use of services that are available, and also to reduce the stigmas to try and get farmers the help that they need. We have professional development webinars is what we call them. And we try to find things that are research-based about farm mental health and put them out in the community. So into the spring, we have a few that are coming on depopulation, which is where you have to get rid of all the animals in your barn because of a disease or weather event, something has happened, and the impacts that has on farmers. We're planning one on transition, the farm transition issue that we talked about a lot in this session. So there's a few of those that are coming this spring. We have one in December about a course that is being offered that helps families, like from a family perspective, deal with some mental health diagnoses within their families. So some really good events, and we're always looking for new ones. And that's it. So here's the barcode to our website if you want to check us out. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We will provide this presentation to